Welcome back to another story on Infidelity Tales Lab. Before we begin, tell us, where in the world are you watching from? Now, let's dive into today's story. Chapter 1. Foundations Built on Sand. Clay McGowan had always believed family meant everything. Growing up in a modest suburban home on Maple Street, he'd watched his father Earl work double shifts at the steel mill, while his mother Verna managed the household finances with military precision. They weren't wealthy, but they were proud. Earl would remind Clay constantly that McGowans don't take handouts from nobody. At 32, Clay had built a comfortable life as a mechanical engineer in downtown Portland. His apartment wasn't luxurious, but it was his. The two-bedroom unit overlooked the river, and he'd spent weekends carefully furnishing it with pieces that reflected his practical nature. Sturdy oak furniture, engineering textbooks lining the shelves, and photographs of the bridges he'd helped design scattered across his desk. His wife, Monica, had always teased him about his attachment to material things. "You treat that coffee table like it's an heirloom," she'd laugh, watching him carefully polish the wood grain. But Clay understood what she didn't. Every piece represented hours of overtime. Every achievement a step away from the financial uncertainty that had defined his childhood. Earl McGowan had never quite forgiven Clay for getting above his station, as he put it. When Clay graduated from engineering school, Earl had grumbled about book learning and wondered aloud why his son couldn't be satisfied with honest manual labor. Verna, always the diplomat, would smooth things over, but Clay noticed how she'd grown distant when he started earning more than Earl ever had. The warning signs were there. Last Christmas, when Clay had offered to pay for a family vacation, Earl had bristled. "We don't need your charity, boy." Verna had nodded approvingly, her thin lips pressed into a disapproving line. When Clay and Monica bought a newer car, Verna had made pointed comments about people who forgot where they came from. But Clay persisted in believing that blood ran deeper than pride. He called every Sunday, sent birthday cards with generous checks that were never acknowledged, and showed up to family dinners where Earl would lecture him about the value of real work, while Verna counted the ways his success somehow diminished theirs. Monica, ever perceptive, had tried to warn him. "They resent your success, Clay. They see it as a judgment on their choices." But Clay couldn't accept that his parents would choose pride over love, bitterness over family bonds. He was about to learn how wrong he was. The apartment had been their sanctuary. Clay had spent months renovating the bathroom, installing custom shelving in the bedroom, and setting up a small workshop in the spare room where he tinkered with model bridges and engineering prototypes. Monica had created a cozy reading nook by the window, complete with her grandmother's antique reading chair and a collection of first-edition novels she'd been accumulating since college. It was more than just a home. It was proof that Clay McGowan had made something of himself. Chapter 2. When the Levee Breaks. The storm hit Portland with unprecedented fury on a Tuesday night in March. Clay woke to the sound of water rushing somewhere it shouldn't be. At first, he thought it was the neighbor's washing machine, but as consciousness fully returned, he realized the sound was coming from below. "Monica, get up," he whispered urgently, shaking his wife awake. "Something's wrong." The basement had flooded completely, and water was rising through the floorboards. By the time they understood the scope of the disaster, muddy river water was ankle-deep throughout their apartment. The building's ancient plumbing system had failed catastrophically, and the storm drains couldn't handle the overflow. Clay watched helplessly as his engineering textbooks floated past, their pages dissolving into expensive pulp. Monica's first-edition novels were submerged, 20 years of careful collecting destroyed in a single night. The oak furniture he'd polished so lovingly was waterlogged and warping. His workshop, with its precise tools and half-finished projects, was completely underwater. The insurance adjuster, a sympathetic woman named Donna Knox, delivered the devastating news 3 days later. "I'm sorry, Mr. McGowan. Your policy covers fire and theft, but flood damage requires separate coverage. The building's insurance will cover structural repairs, but your personal property." She gestured helplessly at the soggy ruins of their life. Clay felt the weight of financial catastrophe settling on his shoulders. Without flood insurance, they'd lost everything. Furniture, electronics, Monica's jewelry, his tools, their photo albums, even their clothes. The emergency fund he'd carefully built would cover a hotel for maybe 2 weeks. That evening, swallowing his pride, Clay called his parents. "Dad, we've had a disaster. Our apartment flooded, and we lost everything. The insurance won't cover it. I was hoping, just temporarily, if Monica and I could stay in your guest room until we get back on our feet." The silence stretched uncomfortably long before Earl's gruff voice responded. "Hold on. Let me get your mother." Clay heard muffled conversation in the background, urgent whispers he couldn't quite make out. When Verna came on the line, her voice was cold and distant. "Clay, honey, I'm sorry about your troubles, but Earl and we need our space. We can't have people staying here disrupting our routine. You'll figure something out. You're smart. You went to college." The dismissal hit him like a physical blow. "Mom, it's just until—" "I said no, Clay. You made your choices. Now you live with them." The line went dead. Clay stared at the phone for a long moment, the reality settling in like a cold weight in his chest. Monica found him sitting on the hotel bed an hour later, still holding the disconnected phone. "What did they say?" she asked gently. "They said no." His voice was barely a whisper. "My own parents said no." That night, Clay lay awake in the cramped hotel room, listening to Monica's quiet breathing beside him. Outside, rain continued to fall, and he wondered how he'd failed to see that his parents' love had always been conditional. When success threatened their narrative of noble struggle, when he needed them to be the safety net they'd always claimed to be, they'd chosen their pride over their son. For the first time in his life, Clay McGowan felt truly alone. Chapter 3. Sleeping in Cars, Building Dreams. The hotel money ran out faster than Clay had calculated. After 2 weeks of burning through their emergency fund, they found themselves with a stark choice: beg for help that wouldn't come, or sleep in their car. Clay parked behind a 24-hour diner on the outskirts of town, far enough from downtown that no one from work would see them. Monica handled the humiliation with more grace than he deserved, never once saying, "I told you so," about his parents, never complaining about washing her hair in gas station bathrooms. The Honda Civic wasn't built for habitation. Clay, at 6'2", had to fold himself into impossible positions to sleep. His back ached constantly, and his pride hurt worse. But something else was growing in that cramped space, a cold, calculating anger that surprised him with its intensity. During the day, Clay threw himself into work with renewed focus. His supervisor, Jeffrey Bright, noticed the change immediately. "McGowan, these bridge calculations are exceptional. This stress distribution analysis, it's graduate-level work." Clay was designing more than bridges now. He was designing a future where he'd never be vulnerable again, never have to ask anyone for help, never trust that family would be there when it mattered. Every spare moment, he researched investment strategies, read about real estate development, and studied the portfolios of self-made millionaires. Monica found part-time work at a bookstore, and together they saved every penny. They bought clothes from thrift stores, ate from dollar menus, and showered at the YMCA. Clay documented every indignity, every night spent cramped in that car, every morning waking with cricks in his neck and rage in his heart. 3 months after the flood, Clay made his first real estate investment, a foreclosed duplex in a neglected neighborhood. He spent evenings and weekends renovating it himself, his engineering background proving invaluable for structural improvements. When he sold it 6 months later, the profit was substantial. "You have an eye for this," Monica observed, watching Clay pore over property listings. "It's like you can see potential where others see problems." Clay smiled grimly. "I learned to see opportunity in destruction." The second property was a small apartment building. Clay leveraged the equity from the duplex, secured a loan, and spent a year transforming the rundown complex into modern, efficient housing. The rental income covered the mortgage and provided capital for the next investment. By the end of the first year, Clay had flipped 3 properties and owned 2 rental buildings. His engineering salary was supplemented by real estate profits that already exceeded his parents' annual income. He opened investment accounts, studied the stock market, and began building a portfolio with the same methodical precision he'd once applied to bridge design. Monica watched the transformation with a mixture of admiration and concern. "Clay, you're brilliant at this, but you're changing. Sometimes I feel like that flood washed away more than our furniture." Clay looked at his wife, seeing the worry in her eyes. She was right. He was changing. The trusting son who'd believed in family bonds was gone, replaced by someone harder, more calculating. Someone who understood that in this world, you either built your own fortress or lived at the mercy of others' whims. "The Clay who begged his parents for help is dead," he said quietly. "This Clay doesn't beg anyone for anything." As their second anniversary of homelessness approached, Clay had accumulated enough wealth to buy a modest house. But modest wasn't his goal anymore. He wanted something that would make a statement, something that would force the world and his parents to acknowledge what he'd become. He wanted a mansion. Chapter 4. The Taste of Success. 2 years after sleeping in his car, Clay McGowan walked through the marble foyer of a $2.3 million estate, his footsteps echoing in the cavernous space. The realtor, Christy Meyer, followed nervously behind, clearly in use to clients who examine property with an engineer's eye for structural integrity rather than just admiring the expensive finishes. The previous owner was a tech entrepreneur, Christy explained, gesturing toward the soaring windows that overlooked the city. He spared no expense on the renovations. Smart home technology throughout, geothermal heating, solar panels. Clay nodded absently, running his fingers along the custom millwork. His portfolio had exploded beyond his wildest expectations. The apartment building had led to a commercial property deal, which had opened doors to larger investments. His engineering background gave him an edge in evaluating structural soundness, while his growing wealth allowed him to move quickly on opportunities others missed. Monica stood in the kitchen, her reflection multiplied in the polished granite surfaces. "Clay, this is beautiful, but it's enormous. It's just the two of us." "For now," Clay replied, his voice carrying an edge she'd learned to recognize. He wasn't just buying a house. He was making a statement. Every square foot was a middle finger raised to the parents who'd valued their space more than their son's welfare. The irony wasn't lost on him. Earl McGowan had spent his entire life complaining about rich people and their excess, while Verna had whispered about neighbors who got too big for their britches. Now Clay was everything they'd taught him to resent, and he wore that transformation like armor. Clay's business partner, Rod Paul, had tried to warn him about moving too fast. "You're leveraged pretty heavily, Clay. Maybe we should consolidate before taking on something this big." But Clay had learned to trust his instincts. The mansion represented more than just a home. It was a fortress, a symbol, and most importantly, a trap. Because Clay had been planning for this moment, when he'd have something his parents might want. The closing took place on a Thursday afternoon. Clay paid cash, having liquidated several investments to avoid the complexity of a mortgage. As Christy handed over the keys, she smiled with the practiced warmth of someone who just earned a substantial commission. "Congratulations, Mr. McGowan. You're going to love living here." Clay pocketed the keys without ceremony. He'd already arranged for Monica's things to be moved from their temporary apartment. His own possessions were few. He'd never replaced most of what the flood had taken. Instead, he'd focused on building something floodwaters could never wash away: power. That weekend, Monica stood in their new master bedroom, unpacking boxes with a mixture of excitement and unease. The room was larger than their entire first apartment, complete with a fireplace and a balcony overlooking the grounds. "Do you ever miss it?" she asked suddenly. The simplicity of how things used to be. Clay paused in hanging his engineering diplomas, the only items he'd salvaged from the flood. "No," he said firmly. "Simple means vulnerable. Vulnerable means sleeping in cars when the people who are supposed to love you decide you're not worth helping." Monica watched her husband with growing concern. Success had given him confidence, but it had also hardened something essential in his character. The gentle man who'd once polished furniture with loving care had been replaced by someone who viewed relationships as transactions and kindness as weakness. But she couldn't deny the satisfaction of watching Clay prove everyone wrong. His former supervisor had tried to lure him back to the engineering firm with a partnership offer, but Clay's real estate empire now generated more in a month than his old salary had in a year. The mansion's security system was state-of-the-art, with cameras covering every entrance and motion sensors throughout the grounds. Clay had insisted on it, claiming concerns about break-ins, but Monica suspected his motivations ran deeper. This wasn't just about protection, it was about control. As Clay stood on the mansion's wraparound porch that first evening, looking out over the manicured grounds he now owned, he thought about his parents. He'd driven past their house the week before, noting the peeling paint and the rusty car in the driveway. Earl still worked at the steel mill, and Verna still clipped coupons and counted pennies. They had no idea what their son had become. That ignorance was about to end. Chapter 5: Fortress of Solitude. The mansion's transformation under Clay's ownership was swift and purposeful. Within 6 months, he'd installed a full workshop in the converted garage, complete with precision tools that made his old equipment look like children's toys. The basement became his office, lined with monitors displaying real-time data from his various investments and properties. Monica had initially embraced their new lifestyle, hosting dinner parties in the formal dining room and reading in the library Clay had commissioned. But as the months passed, she noticed how few genuine friends they had. Clay's business associates were respectful but distant, and his wealth seemed to create a barrier between them and the kind of easy relationships they'd once enjoyed. "We used to have people over for pizza and board games," Monica observed one evening, watching Clay review architectural plans for another property acquisition. "Now everything feels so formal, so calculated." Clay looked up from his drawings, his expression softening slightly when he saw her concern. "We can have pizza if you want. I'll order from that place downtown, the one with truffle oil." "That's not the point, Clay." Monica sat beside him, studying the face she'd loved for years but sometimes struggled to recognize. "You've achieved everything you set out to do. You've proven yourself a dozen times over. When does it end?" Clay set down his pencil, considering her question seriously. "It ends when I'm never vulnerable again. When I have enough power that no one can ever leave me sleeping in a car." The conversation was interrupted by Clay's phone buzzing with a text message. He glanced at it absently, then froze. The number was one he'd memorized years ago, but hadn't seen on his screen since that terrible night when his world had collapsed. "Who is it?" Monica asked, noting the sudden tension in his posture. Clay stared at the message, his heart rate accelerating despite his attempts to remain calm. After 3 years of silence, his mother had finally reached out. But she wasn't calling to apologize. The text was brief and desperate. "Clay, there's a wildfire. We've been evacuated. The hotel is full. We have nowhere to go. Please let us stay with you." Clay read the message 3 times, his mind processing the delicious irony. His parents, who had valued their space above their son's welfare, were now homeless themselves. They were asking for exactly what they'd refused to give: temporary shelter from disaster. Monica peered over his shoulder, reading the message. "Oh my God, Clay. Are they okay? We have to help them." Clay's response was immediate and instinctive. "Do we?" The coldness in his voice made Monica step back. "Clay, they're your parents. Whatever happened between you, they're in danger." Clay stood slowly, walking to the massive windows that overlooked his estate. In the distance, he could see the orange glow on the horizon where the wildfire was consuming everything in its path. Weather reports had been tracking the blaze for days, and Clay had watched with interest as it moved toward his parents' neighborhood. He'd even checked to make sure their homeowner's insurance was adequate. Earl had always been paranoid about coverage, even when he couldn't afford comprehensive policies. They'd be fine financially, assuming they survived. "They made their choice 3 years ago," Clay said finally. "They chose their space over their family. Actions have consequences." Monica stared at her husband in disbelief. "You can't be serious. You're going to let them sleep in their car? After everything we went through?" Clay turned back to her, his expression unreadable. "I'm not going to let them sleep in their car, Monica. I'm going to do exactly what they did for me, give them advice about being smart and figuring something out." But even as he spoke, Clay's mind was working on a different level. His parents' desperation presented an opportunity he'd been unconsciously preparing for since the day they'd abandoned him. This wasn't just about revenge. It was about justice, about teaching them exactly what they'd taught him about the true nature of family loyalty. Clay picked up his phone and began typing a response, each word carefully chosen for maximum impact. Chapter 6. The Reckoning Arrives. Clay's response was swift and surgical. I'll need to think about it. You understand? I need my space. He sent the message and set his phone aside, watching Monica's expression shift from shock to horror. Clay, that's cruel. Whatever they did, they don't deserve. Don't they? Clay's voice remained eerily calm. They're experiencing exactly what they put us through. The only difference is we have options now. Monica grabbed the phone, rereading the exchange. This isn't you, Clay. The man I married wouldn't leave people, his own parents, homeless during a natural disaster. Clay walked to his desk and pulled out a thick folder he'd been maintaining for 3 years. Inside were detailed financial records, property assessments, and documentation of every humiliation he'd endured. At the bottom was a single photograph, Clay and Monica's Honda Civic parked behind the diner, their temporary home for those awful months. The man you married died sleeping in that car, Clay said quietly. I'm what grew from his ashes. The phone buzzed again. This time it was Earl. Son, please. We're scared. There's ash falling like snow, and we can't find anywhere to stay. Just for tonight. Clay studied the message with the detached interest of a scientist observing an experiment. His father, who'd never called him son with any warmth, was now pleading for mercy. The irony was exquisite. Monica was pacing now, her distress evident. Clay, look outside. You can see the fire from here. They could die. Through the mansion's windows, the wildfire's glow had intensified. News reports showed evacuated families crowding into emergency shelters, sleeping on gymnasium floors, their faces etched with the same desperation Clay remembered from his own months of homelessness. They won't die, Clay said with certainty. Earl's too stubborn, and Verna's too mean. They'll find somewhere. They always do, when they want to. But Clay was already calculating, planning the next phase of what he'd begun to think of as his masterpiece. This wasn't just about turning his parents away. That would be simple cruelty, satisfying, but ultimately empty. No, Clay had spent 3 years building something more elegant. A demonstration of power that would force them to understand exactly what they'd lost when they'd chosen pride over family. His phone rang, not a text this time, but an actual call. The caller ID showed Verna's number, and Clay let it ring 4 times before answering. Hello, Mother. Clay. Verna's voice was raw with smoke and tears. Thank God you answered. We're at the evacuation center, but it's full. They're turning people away. We tried 3 hotels, nothing. We're in the car right now, and the smoke is getting worse. Clay could hear Earl's voice in the background, angry and desperate. Is that him? Let me talk to him. Clay, honey, I know we haven't talked much lately, but we're family. We need help. Clay closed his eyes, savoring the moment he'd unconsciously been preparing for since that terrible night 3 years ago. Let me ask you something, Mom. When Monica and I were homeless, sleeping in our car, eating from dollar menus, were we family then? The silence on the other end stretched uncomfortably long. That was different, Verna said finally, her voice smaller now. You were young. You could handle it. Different how? Because you decided it was different. Clay heard Earl grab the phone. Boy, this isn't the time for your hurt feelings. We're in real danger here. Clay's laugh was soft and utterly without humor. Hurt feelings? Dad, you taught me something valuable that night. You taught me that family is just a word people use when they want something. You taught me that love is conditional, that help comes with strings attached, and that when people show you who they really are, you should believe them. Clay, please. Clay ended the call and immediately blocked both numbers. Monica stared at him in disbelief. You blocked them? Clay, they could. They'll be fine, Clay said, already moving toward his office. Trust me, I know exactly where they'll end up. Because Clay had spent the last 6 months preparing for this moment, setting pieces in motion with the same methodical precision he'd once applied to bridge design. His parents' crisis was about to become his opportunity, not just for revenge, but for a lesson they'd remember for the rest of their lives. The real game was just beginning. Chapter 7. The Puppet Master's Design. 3 hours after blocking his parents' numbers, Clay received a call from his property manager, Suzanne Everett. Her voice was professionally cheerful despite the late hour. "Mr. McGowan, you're not going to believe this, but we just had 2 people show up at the Riverside Apartments, Unit 4B. They're claiming to be your parents? They said you told them they could stay there temporarily because of the wildfire." Clay smiled into the phone. "That's correct, Suzanne. I've been expecting them. Please get them settled in immediately." Monica, who had been listening to Clay's half of the conversation, looked confused. "I thought you said—" "I said I wasn't going to let them sleep in their car," Clay interrupted. "I never said I was going to leave them to die." Unit 4B was special. Clay had purchased the entire apartment complex 18 months ago, but he'd left one unit deliberately unrented, maintained but vacant. It was a 1-bedroom apartment with a leaky faucet he'd never bothered to fix, outdated appliances that barely functioned, and a heating system that worked intermittently at best. It was, in other words, exactly the quality of accommodation his parents had decided he and Monica deserved during their crisis. "Clay, what are you doing?" Monica's voice carried a warning tone. "I'm teaching them a lesson about hospitality," Clay replied, pulling up the building's security system on his computer. Multiple camera feeds showed the apartment complex, including the interior of Unit 4B, which Clay had wired extensively during renovations. On the screen, Earl and Verna McGowan stood in the dingy living room, their faces a mixture of relief and disgust. Earl was examining the peeling wallpaper while Verna investigated the kitchenette, her expression souring as she discovered the broken stove and the refrigerator that buzzed ominously. "This place is a dump." Earl's voice crackled through the security system's audio feed. "I thought Clay made good money now." Verna was poking at the lumpy couch that served as the room's only seating. "Maybe this is his idea of getting back at us. You know how he holds grudges." Clay adjusted the volume, fascinated by this unguarded glimpse into his parents' true feelings. Monica watched beside him, her discomfort evident. "Clay, this feels wrong. You're spying on them." "I'm observing the natural behavior of subjects in their environment," Clay replied clinically. "It's educational." On screen, Earl was testing the bathroom faucet, which immediately began dripping with the persistence Clay had engineered months ago. The sound echoed through the small space. Drip, 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 a metronome of minor irritation. "At least we're not sleeping in the car," Verna said, settling gingerly onto the couch. "Though I don't understand why Clay couldn't put us up in that mansion. It's just pride, making us stay here instead." Clay's jaw tightened. Even now, even when he was providing them shelter they hadn't earned, they were complaining about the quality of his charity. "How long do you think we'll have to stay here?" Earl asked, examining a water stain on the ceiling. "Until the fire's out and we can go home," Verna replied. "Assuming there's a home to go back to." Clay switched to his laptop, pulling up satellite footage of the wildfire. His parents' neighborhood was directly in the path of the blaze, and preliminary reports suggested extensive property damage. Their house, the house where Clay had grown up, where he'd been turned away in his moment of need, was likely ash by now. "Clay," Monica said softly, recognizing the expression on her husband's face. "Whatever you're thinking, please remember that they're still people. They're still your parents." Clay turned to his wife, his expression serene but unreadable. "They stopped being my parents the night they chose their space over their son. Now they're just people who share my DNA and are about to learn what consequences feel like." He opened another window on his computer, this one showing financial projections and property assessments. Clay had been remarkably prescient in his investments, buying insurance against exactly this type of scenario. While his parents would receive insurance payouts for their destroyed home, Clay controlled something far more valuable in their current situation: available housing. Over the past year, he'd quietly acquired a controlling interest in most of the rental properties in the area. Not enough to constitute a monopoly, that would be illegal, but enough to significantly influence the local housing market, especially when combined with his network of business contacts in real estate and property management. With a few phone calls and some strategic financial incentives, Clay could ensure that his parents found the rental market surprisingly tight, the available options mysteriously just beyond their budget, the application processes unexpectedly complex and time-consuming. They could stay in Unit 4B for as long as Clay deemed appropriate. And Clay had very specific ideas about how long that should be. "What are you going to do?" Monica asked, though her tone suggested she already suspected the answer wouldn't comfort her. Clay's smile was cold and precise. "I'm going to give them exactly what they gave me. Every single day of it." Chapter 8. The Mathematics of Justice. The next morning brought news that confirmed Clay's calculations. His parents' house was completely destroyed, along with most of their neighborhood. The wildfire had consumed 47 homes before firefighters managed to contain it, leaving dozens of families homeless and dependent on emergency services. Clay watched the news coverage from his mansion's breakfast room, sipping coffee from expensive china while Monica pushed eggs around her plate, her appetite apparently diminished by the images of destruction. "The Red Cross is setting up temporary housing," Monica said hopefully. "Maybe your parents can." "They can apply like everyone else," Clay interrupted, not looking away from the television. "I'm sure they'll figure something out. They're smart people." On screen, a reporter interviewed displaced families at the evacuation center. Clay recognized several neighbors from his childhood, people who'd known him as Earl and Verna's boy. They looked exhausted and shell-shocked, clutching insurance paperwork and trying to comfort crying children. Clay's phone buzzed with a text from his property manager. "Your guests in 4B are asking about the heating. The unit's pretty cold." Clay typed back, "The heating system is functional. If they're cold, they can find extra blankets." What Suzanne didn't know, what Clay hadn't mentioned when he'd arranged for his parents' accommodation, was that he controlled the building's heating system remotely. Unit 4B was currently receiving minimal heat, just enough to prevent the pipes from freezing, but not enough for comfort. Clay had learned about discomfort during those months sleeping in his car. He'd learned about being cold, about making do with inadequate resources, about the grinding daily indignities of not having a real home. His education had been thorough and memorable. Now it was his parents' turn to learn. "Clay," Monica said carefully, "what exactly are you trying to accomplish here?" Clay set down his coffee cup and looked at his wife with the patient expression he might use to explain engineering principles to a first-year student. "I'm conducting an experiment in empathy," he said. "For 3 years, my parents have lived comfortable lives, secure in the knowledge that their decision to abandon their son was justified. They've told themselves stories about why we deserve what happened to us, why their response was reasonable and proportionate." He pulled up the security footage on his tablet, showing Earl and Verna huddled together on the broken couch, sharing a thin blanket. Now they get to experience what they put us through. Every uncomfortable night, every moment of uncertainty, every small indignity of depending on someone else's charity. The only difference is that their benefactor actually has the power to help them, and chooses not to. Monica stared at the screen, watching Clay's parents struggle with the apartment's dysfunctional heating system. "How long are you planning to keep them there?" Clay smiled, pulling up a calendar on his laptop. He'd already done the math. "Monica and I were homeless for exactly 97 days, he said, highlighting the dates. "I think that's a reasonable time frame for my parents to experience alternative housing arrangements." "Clay, you can't be serious. 97 days in that place? It's December. They're in their 60s. "I was 32 with a pregnant wife," Clay replied, his voice hardening. "No, wait, that was a different story. We were just 32 with dreams and trust in family. Age and circumstances don't excuse cruelty. Monica, they amplify it." Clay's phone rang, his private line that only a few people knew. The caller ID showed Jeffrey Bright, his former supervisor at the engineering firm. "Clay, I just heard about your parents' situation. I wanted to offer my help. I know things have been complicated between you all, but if they need temporary housing, Jennifer and I have a guest room." "That's very generous, Jeff," Clay interrupted smoothly, "but they're already taken care of. I've arranged accommodation for them." "Oh, good. I was worried with the fire and all the shelters being full. Where are they staying?" Clay looked at the security footage, watching his father curse at the dripping faucet while his mother tried to coax heat from the broken radiator. Somewhere appropriate, Clay said, somewhere that matches their level of hospitality. After ending the call, Clay made several more to property managers, insurance adjusters, and rental agencies throughout the region. Each conversation was brief and professional, but the message was consistent. The McGowan family's housing application should be processed slowly, their references checked thoroughly, their credit examined with particular scrutiny. Not illegal, not even unethical, strictly speaking. Just the kind of bureaucratic delays that happen when the housing market is tight and landlords can afford to be selective. Monica watched her husband orchestrate his parents' isolation with growing horror. This isn't justice, Clay. This is torture. Clay looked up from his phone, his expression genuinely puzzled. Is it? Because from my perspective, it's education. I'm teaching them what they taught me. That family is conditional, that help comes with judgment, and that sometimes the people who are supposed to love you will choose their comfort over your welfare. He returned to the security footage, zooming in on his parents' faces. Earl was trying to fix the leaky faucet with a kitchen knife, his frustration evident in every movement. Verna was sitting on the edge of the bed, her shoulders shaking. Whether from cold or tears, Clay couldn't tell. The beauty of this arrangement, Clay continued, is that they can leave any time they want. All they have to do is find someone else willing to help them, someone who values family above comfort. I'm sure there are plenty of people like that, people who are better than they are. Monica stood abruptly, her chair scraping against the marble floor. I can't watch this anymore. Whatever they did to you, this isn't who you used to be. Clay looked at his wife with something approaching sadness. No, it's not. The person I used to be believed in forgiveness and second chances and the fundamental goodness of family. That person was naive and weak, and he paid for those beliefs by sleeping in a car and begging for scraps of human decency. He gestured toward the mansion around them, toward the wealth and power he'd accumulated. This person, the person I am now, understands that strength is the only thing that matters. That mercy is a luxury you can only afford from a position of power, and that sometimes the most loving thing you can do for someone is to teach them the consequences of their choices. Clay's phone buzzed again. Another text from the property manager. Your guests are asking if they can speak with you. They seem pretty upset about the living conditions. Clay's smile was cold and satisfied as he typed his response. Tell them I'm considering their situation. I need time to think about it. I need my space. Chapter 9. The final lesson. 37 days into their stay at Unit 4B, Earl McGowan finally broke. Clay watched through the security cameras as his father, a man who'd spent his entire life preaching about dignity and self-reliance, fell to his knees beside the broken couch and wept. Verna sat beside him, her hand on his shaking shoulders, her own face hollow with exhaustion and defeat. Please, Earl whispered to the empty room, unaware that his son was watching every humiliating second. Please, Clay. I'm sorry. I'm so sorry. Clay felt Monica's presence behind him, but he didn't turn around. She'd been spending more time at her sister's house lately, unable to watch what her husband had become. Their marriage was fracturing under the weight of his calculated cruelty, but Clay found he cared less about that than he'd expected. Love, he'd learned, was just another weakness that people could exploit. It's enough, Monica said quietly. You've made your point. They're broken. Clay finally turned to face his wife, noting the shadows under her eyes, the way she stood near the door, as if ready to flee. Have I really made my point? Because breaking them was never the goal, Monica. Teaching them was the goal. He pulled up a different screen on his computer. Insurance reports, property assessments, and financial projections. Their house is gone, and the insurance payout will cover maybe 60% of replacement costs. The housing market in their area has become mysteriously tight, with very few rentals available at prices they can afford. Their savings are depleting rapidly, and Earl's too proud to ask anyone else for help. Monica stared at the data, understanding dawning in her expression. You've orchestrated all of this. The housing shortage, the delayed applications. You've been manipulating their entire situation. Clay nodded without shame. I've been providing them with a comprehensive education in helplessness. They're experiencing what it feels like to be completely dependent on someone else's mercy, to have no options, no leverage, no power to change their circumstances. On the security monitor, Verna was now crying too, her face buried in her hands. The apartment around them looked like what it was, a barely habitable space that no one would choose to live in if they had alternatives. They don't have alternatives, Clay continued, because I've made sure they don't. Just like I didn't have alternatives when they turned me away. The only difference is that I'm not cruel enough to leave them sleeping in their car. Clay's phone rang. Earl's number, unblocked for the first time in over a month. Clay let it ring twice before answering. Hello, Dad. Son. Earl's voice was broken, aged years in just over a month. I need to talk to you. Face to face. Please. Clay looked at Monica, seeing the plea in her eyes. I suppose I could spare some time. Why don't you and Mom come over for dinner tonight? I'll send a car. The silence on the other end stretched uncomfortably long. You want us to come to your house? After keeping us in this place. I want to have a conversation about family, Dad. About what it means, what it costs, and what happens when people betray it. 7 o'clock. Don't be late. Clay ended the call and turned to Monica, who was watching him with a mixture of fear and fascination. This is your chance to be the better person, she said desperately. You can forgive them, help them rebuild, show them the mercy they didn't show you. Clay's smile was sad and final. Oh, Monica, I'm going to show them mercy. I'm going to give them exactly what they asked for 3 years ago. That evening, Clay's parents arrived at the mansion in the car he'd sent, a luxury sedan that made their current circumstances even more starkly evident by comparison. Verna clutched a worn purse, her clothes clean but obviously old. Earl had lost weight, his face gaunt and his shoulders permanently hunched. Clay greeted them at the door wearing a perfectly tailored suit, the very picture of success and prosperity. Behind him, the mansion stretched in obvious abundance. Marble floors, crystal chandeliers, and warmth that seemed to radiate from every surface. Mom, Dad, welcome to my home. They followed him to the dining room, where Monica had set the table with her finest china. The meal was elaborate, everything Clay remembered his parents loving but rarely being able to afford when he was growing up. For 20 minutes, they ate in near silence, the only sounds the clink of silverware and the soft crackle of the fireplace. Finally, Earl set down his fork and looked at his son. Clay, I need to apologize. For that night, for how he treated you. We were wrong. Clay set down his own fork, his expression attentive but unreadable. What exactly are you apologizing for, Dad? For turning you away. For not helping when you needed it. For, Earl's voice broke. For failing you as parents. Verna nodded, tears streaming down her cheeks. We were proud and stubborn and stupid. We let our own insecurities hurt our son, and we've regretted it every day since. Clay leaned back in his chair, considering their words. What about your space, Mom? What about needing your routine undisturbed? That was an excuse, Verna whispered. We were jealous of your success, afraid that helping you might somehow diminish us. We were small and petty and wrong. And now, Clay asked gently, now you understand what it feels like to need help and be turned away. Earl nodded miserably. We understand. We understand everything. And we know we don't deserve your forgiveness, but we're begging for it anyway. Clay stood and walked to the window, looking out over his estate. In the distance, city lights twinkled like earthbound stars, and he could see the skeletal remains of construction cranes where new developments were rising from cleared land. You know what the interesting thing is? Clay said finally, I've discovered that I can't forgive you. I forgave you months ago, actually, because holding on to anger is exhausting and I have more important things to do with my energy. His parents looked up with desperate hope. But forgiveness doesn't mean there are no consequences, Clay continued. It doesn't mean we pretend the past didn't happen, or that trust can be rebuilt with apologies. He turned back to face them, his expression calm and final. You're going to stay in Unit 4B for 57 more days because that's what justice requires. You're going to experience every single day of homelessness that Monica and I endured because that's what education demands. And when those 57 days are over, you're going to move somewhere else, anywhere else, and rebuild your lives with the knowledge of what it truly means to be vulnerable. Earl started to protest, but Clay raised a hand. I'm not done. You're also going to receive a check for $50,000, enough to start over somewhere new, somewhere far from here. Because unlike you, I don't abandon family members to sleep in cars. Clay walked back to his chair and sat down, his posture relaxed, but his eyes hard as steel. The lesson isn't that I'm cruel, Dad. The lesson is that I'm better than you are. I'm stronger than you are. And I'm more loyal to family than you ever were, even when that family doesn't deserve it. Verna was sobbing openly now, her hands covering her face. Earl stared at his son with a mixture of awe and terror. "You're going to let us go?" Earl asked finally. Clay's smile was gentle and absolutely merciless. "I'm going to do exactly what you did to me, Dad. I'm going to give you advice about being smart and figuring something out. The difference is, I'm smart enough and successful enough to actually help if I choose to. And I'm choosing to help just enough to prove that I'm the better man." Clay stood again, signaling that the dinner was over. "The car will take you back to the apartment. In 57 days, you'll receive your check and a 30-day notice to vacate. What you do after that is entirely up to you." As his parents were led back to the car, Monica touched Clay's arm. "Do you feel better now? Does this feel like justice?" Clay looked at his wife, this woman who'd stood by him through homelessness and success, but was now looking at him like a stranger. "It feels like education," he said simply. "They asked for space, and I gave them exactly what they needed to understand what space really costs." Outside, the car carrying his parents disappeared into the night, taking them back to their small, cold apartment where they would count down 57 more days of consequence. Clay McGowan stood in his mansion, surrounded by wealth and power and the perfect, terrible justice he'd built with his own hands. He had won completely, proved his point beyond any possible doubt, and ensured that his parents would never again underestimate the cost of abandoning family. He'd also lost his wife, his capacity for simple happiness, and any remaining illusion that revenge could heal the wound that had been carved into his heart that night 3 years ago. But winning, Clay had learned, was more important than healing. Power was more reliable than love. And sometimes, the most perfect justice was indistinguishable from the very cruelty it sought to punish. In 57 days, Earl and Verna McGowan would be free to start over. Clay McGowan, surrounded by his fortress of success and superiority, would remain exactly where he was, victorious, vindicated, and utterly, completely alone. And there you have it. Another story comes to an end. What did you think? I'd love to hear your thoughts in the comments below. If you enjoy this story, consider joining our community by subscribing. It means the world to us. For more stories like this one, check out the recommended videos on screen. And I'll see you there.